Welcome back to Whispers in the Dark. Tonight, we enter a story of wealth, bloodlines, prophecy, and a child whose face is sweet enough to fool the world. A child with black hair, pale skin, watchful eyes, and a smile that appears only when something terrible is about to happen. This is a story of a family that thought it had been blessed. A father who chose silence over truth. A mother who felt love turn slowly into dread. A priest who tried to warn them. A photographer who saw death hiding in light. And a boy named Damien Thorn, whose little hand could close around yours like any child's, warm and soft, while something ancient and merciless watched from behind his eyes. So lower the lights, listen closely, and remember this. Not every child is born crying. Some are born waiting. Now let's begin. The storm over Rome had begun just before midnight. It came rolling over the city in black waves, swallowing the ancient rooftops, rattling windows, and turning the narrow streets slick with rain. Thunder pressed down on the hospital like the voice of something buried beneath the earth. The maternity ward smelled of disinfectant, damp stone, and candle wax from the chapel at the far end of the corridor, where one little red flame trembled before the Virgin Mary. Robert Thorn stood alone beneath the harsh white lights, his expensive suit soaked at the shoulders, his hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. He was an American diplomat, a man raised to control his face, his tone, his grief. He had spent his life in polished rooms, beneath chandeliers and flags, speaking calmly while governments shifted around him. But in that hospital corridor, with rain crawling down the high windows and thunder breaking across the sky, he looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His wife, Catherine, lay sleeping in a room nearby. She did not know. She had carried their child through 9 months of hope, sickness, whispered prayers, and late-night laughter. She had decorated a nursery in soft colors. She had folded tiny clothes and placed them in drawers with careful, trembling hands. She had chosen a name. She had spoken to the baby in the dark, one hand on her stomach, telling him about his father, about the home they would make, about the love waiting for him. And now the child was dead. The doctor had told Robert quietly, with the careful pity of a man who had practiced it too many times. The baby had died before Catherine ever saw him. There had been complications. There had been bleeding. There was nothing anyone could have done. Robert had heard the words, but they had seemed to come from underwater. Dead. His son was dead. Catherine would wake soon and ask for the baby. Robert imagined her face when he told her. He imagined the light leaving her eyes. He imagined her arms reaching for a child that would never be placed there. That was when the priest came. He appeared at the end of the corridor, as though he had stepped out of the storm itself. He was tall and thin, dressed in black, his white collar bright as bone against his throat. His face was narrow, his eyes sunken, and wet with something that was not sorrow alone. "Mr. Thorn," he said. Robert turned slowly. The priest came closer. His shoes whispered on the polished floor. Somewhere behind him, a door creaked in the night. "My name is Father Sparleto," the priest said. "I know what has happened." Robert stared at him. "My wife does not." "No," said the priest, "and she need not." The words were so wrong, so sudden, that Robert did not understand them at first. He frowned, too exhausted to be angry. "What did you say?" Father Sparleto looked toward Catherine's door, then back at Robert. "There is a child," he said, "a newborn boy. His mother died tonight. He has no family. No one will claim him." Robert felt a coldness move through him. The priest continued, his voice low, urgent, almost feverish. "Your wife need never know. She wanted a child. You wanted a son. God has placed one before you." Robert shook his head. "No. Listen to me. No. She cannot bear the truth tonight. Perhaps not ever. This child can save her from that pain." Robert stepped back. "This is madness." Father Sparleto's eyes glittered in the electric light. "Madness is leaving a mother broken when mercy is within reach." Thunder crashed so loudly that the lights blinked. For one instant, the corridor went dark. In that darkness, Robert heard something. A baby crying, not near Catherine's room, not from the nursery, from somewhere deeper in the hospital, somewhere behind closed doors and locked wards. The cry was not loud, but it carried. It seemed to slip under Robert's skin. Father Sparleto watched him. "Come," he whispered. Robert should have refused. He should have turned away, gone to his wife, held her hand, and waited for her to wake into grief. He should have spoken the truth, no matter how cruel. Instead, he followed the priest. They moved through the sleeping hospital, down a service stairwell that smelled of wet plaster and old pipes, along a corridor where some of the bulbs had burned out. The deeper they went, the less the hospital seemed like a place of healing. The walls became older. The paint peeled in damp curls. The air grew stale. At last, they reached a small room behind the nursery. A single lamp burned beside a metal cot. Inside it lay the child. He was beautiful. That was the first thing Robert noticed. And later, when the guilt came for him in the dark, it was the thing that frightened him most. The baby was perfect. Dark hair lay damp against his small head. His skin had a soft, ivory glow. His mouth was tiny and red. His eyes were closed, his fists curled beside his cheeks. He was not crying anymore. He was silent. Robert stepped closer despite himself. The baby opened his eyes. They were dark, almost black. And although Robert knew newborn eyes were unfocused, new babies could not truly see or understand. He felt with absolute certainty that this child was looking directly at him, choosing him. Father Sparleto spoke beside him. "His mother is dead. He has no name." Robert whispered, "Where is she?" The priest did not answer. Robert looked around the room. There was a cloth bundle on a table near the wall. For a moment, He thought it might be laundry. Then he saw the shape of a hand beneath the sheet. Thin fingers, a wrist. Something dark had soaked through the fabric near where the throat would be. A nurse entered quickly and stood in front of it. Robert's stomach turned. "What happened to her?" he asked. Father Sparleto placed a hand on his arm. "Do not ask what you cannot bear to know." The baby kept staring at Robert. Outside, the storm clawed at the glass. When Catherine woke the next morning, Robert placed the child in her arms and told her he was their son. She wept with joy. She named him Damien. 5 years passed. By then, Robert Thorn had become the United States ambassador to Great Britain. He and Catherine lived in a grand house outside London, a place of clipped lawns, dark wood, tall windows, and silence so deep it seemed expensive. Servants moved quietly through the corridors. Cars came and went across the gravel drive. Important people attended dinners beneath silver lamps. Photographers waited outside the gates, and in the center of it all was Damien. He was a handsome child with glossy black hair, round cheeks, and large, serious eyes. He wore tailored little suits and polished shoes. He had the kind of face strangers wanted to touch, though many of them stopped themselves when he looked up at them. There was something in his gaze that made adults laugh nervously, then look away. Catherine loved him fiercely, but there were moments when that love caught on something sharp. Damien did not like churches. If the car passed too close to one, he grew pale and began to scream. Not the tired scream of a child denied a toy, not the ordinary rage of a spoiled boy. This was something else, a shrieking terror that filled the car until the driver's hands shook on the wheel. He did not like priests. When Robert hosted dinners and clergymen attended, Damien would stand in the doorway and stare at them without blinking. Once, an old bishop reached down to bless him. Damien smiled, and the bishop suddenly gasped, clutched his chest, and had to be helped into another room. Animals hated him, or feared him. Dogs lowered their heads when he passed. Horses thrashed in their stalls. Birds struck windows until their necks snapped and their small bodies slid down the glass in streaks of blood. Only one animal ever came willingly to Damien. A huge black Rottweiler appeared on the grounds one cold morning, standing beyond the hedges as though it had always belonged there. Its coat shone like wet tar. Its eyes were amber and intelligent. When the groundskeeper tried to chase it off, the dog bared its teeth and made a sound so deep that the man backed away with both hands raised. Damien saw it from the nursery window. He smiled. The dog stayed. The birthday party was held on a bright afternoon beneath a clean blue sky. There were balloons on the lawn, white tables set with cake and lemonade, children running between the hedges, mothers in pale dresses, fathers in summer suits, servants moving with trays. Catherine stood beside Robert, laughing for the cameras, one hand resting lightly on Damien's shoulder. Damien wore a neat blue outfit and a small paper crown. He looked bored. His nanny, Holly, stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the lawn. She was a young woman with soft brown hair and a gentle face. She adored Damien, perhaps too much. Catherine had noticed it before. Holly would kneel beside the boy for long stretches, whispering to him, brushing his hair, letting him press his small hand against her cheek. Sometimes, Catherine entered the room and found Holly staring at Damien as though waiting for instructions. That afternoon, as the children sang for cake, Holly looked across the lawn. Near the hedge stood the black Rottweiler. No one else seemed to notice it. The dog stared up at the balcony. Holly's face changed. All warmth drained from it. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with revelation. Her mouth opened slightly. She looked suddenly peaceful. The party continued below. Damien looked up. Holly smiled at him. Then she stepped back into the nursery. A few minutes later, as Robert lifted Damien so he could blow out the candles, something dropped from above and struck the side of the house with a wet crack. The guests screamed. Children turned. A body swung from the second-floor balcony. Holly hung by the neck from a rope tied to the railing, her face swollen and purple, her eyes bulging, her tongue dark between her teeth. Her shoes dangled and twitched in the open air. The wind moved her dress softly against her legs. Blood from where the rope had bitten into her throat trickled down her skin and dotted the stone below. For one awful moment, no one moved. Then the screaming began properly. Catherine clutched Damien to her chest. Robert looked up at Holly's dead face. Her eyes stared not at the crowd, not at the sky, but down at Damien. And though everyone around him was crying, retching, covering children's eyes, Damien only watched the hanging body with the faintest trace of a smile. Later, the police called it a suicide, a tragic event, a disturbed young woman, perhaps hidden mental illness, perhaps obsession with the child. There were questions, of course, but wealth has a way of softening questions. Influence has a way of closing doors. The rope was removed. The balcony was scrubbed. The birthday cake was thrown away. A week later, a new nanny arrived. Her name was Mrs. Baylock. She was middle-aged, solid, pale, and dressed in severe dark clothing. Her hair was pulled back tightly from her face. She had a calm manner and eyes like stones at the bottom of a cold pond. Catherine disliked her immediately. Robert, distracted by work and the scandal around Holly's death, barely noticed. Mrs. Baylock came with excellent references. She was efficient. She was quiet. She seemed to know exactly what Damien needed before anyone asked. Damien accepted her without question. The first night she put him to bed, Catherine passed the nursery and heard whispering inside. She paused. Mrs. Baylock's voice was soft. "You need not be afraid of me, little one." Catherine pushed the door open. The nanny stood beside Damien's bed, with her hand resting on his forehead. Damien lay still, eyes open, watching his mother. Mrs. Baylock turned. "Mrs. Thorn," she said pleasantly. He was restless. Catherine looked at her son, Damien. He did not answer. Mrs. Baylock smiled. "He knows I am here to protect him." A few days later, Catherine discovered the Rottweiler sleeping in Damien's room. It was stretched across the rug beside his bed, massive head resting on its paws, amber eyes open in the dark. Catherine screamed. Robert came running. The dog rose slowly, lips curling back from its teeth. Mrs. Baylock appeared behind them in her nightdress, strangely calm. "Who brought that animal into the house?" Catherine demanded. Mrs. Baylock placed one hand on Damien's bedroom door. "The child likes him," she said. "I want it gone." Damien sat up in bed. For a second, Catherine saw something pass across his face. Not sadness, not anger, something older. The dog growled. Robert called for the groundskeeper the next morning, but by then the animal had vanished. No one could find where it slept, where it ate, how it entered the house. Yet Catherine saw it again and again, watching from the tree line, from beneath the nursery window, from the shadow of the staircase at night. It was always there when Damien was near. The first warning came from Father Brennan. He found Robert outside the embassy on a gray afternoon, pushing through reporters and security with desperate strength. He was thin, sweaty, frantic. His black coat hung from him as though he had slept in it for weeks. His face was lined with terror. "Mr. Thorn," he called. "Ambassador Thorn." Robert kept walking. Security tried to block the priest, but Brennan shouted with such force that people turned. "You must listen. It concerns the child." Robert stopped. The priest's eyes locked onto him. "Damien." Robert felt irritation before fear. He had been dealing with threats since taking the ambassador post. Men sent letters. Madmen waited outside gates. Fanatics saw conspiracies in every public figure. But Brennan's expression did not look like madness. It looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the world. Robert allowed him 5 minutes in a private room. Father Brennan entered, trembling, his eyes darting toward the windows, as though expecting something to be watching from the glass. "The child is not yours," he said. Robert's face hardened. "Get out." His mother was not human. Robert grabbed the priest by the arm. "I said get out." Brennan's voice rose. His mother was a jackal. The words struck the room like a slap. Robert stared at him. Father Brennan leaned close, breath sour with fear. "I was there. I was part of it. I helped them. God forgive me. I helped bring him into the world. The child must die, Mr. Thorn. If he lives, the world will belong to him." Robert shoved him away. "You are sick." "Yes," Brennan whispered, "sick with knowing." Robert ordered security to remove him. As they dragged the priest out, Brennan twisted back toward him and shouted, "Your wife is pregnant. The child will not allow it to live. He will kill the unborn first, Then the mother. Go to the city of Megiddo. Find Bugenhagen. Learn how to kill him before it is too late. Robert stood frozen. Catherine had not told anyone. She had only told Robert that morning. She was pregnant. That night, Robert came home late. The house was quiet. Rain tapped at the windows. Catherine sat alone in the nursery, though Damien was asleep in the next room. She looked tired, too tired. There were shadows under her eyes, and one hand moved absently over her stomach. I want an abortion, she said. Robert stared at her. Catherine did not cry. That was what frightened him. Her face was still. I know that sounds terrible, she continued. But I cannot have this baby. I cannot. Something is wrong in this house. Something is wrong with Damien. Robert closed the door behind him. He is our son. No, Catherine whispered. The word was barely audible. Robert felt anger rise, but beneath it was fear. And beneath the fear was the memory of a crying newborn in a hidden room. Catherine looked at him. Sometimes he stands at the end of the bed at night. He just stands there and watches me. I wake up and he is smiling. Robert said nothing. He frightens me, she said. My own child frightens me. From somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Catherine's eyes shifted toward the door. The next day, Mrs. Baylock took Damien to the zoo. Catherine went with them, hoping sunlight and ordinary things might loosen the knot inside her chest. The zoo was crowded with families. Children pressed sticky hands against glass. Monkeys shrieked. Peacocks moved like pieces of jeweled cloth across the lawns. Damien walked silently between Catherine and Mrs. Baylock, holding neither of their hands. At first it seemed fine. Then they reached the baboon enclosure. The animals saw Damien. The nearest baboon froze, its lips peeling back from yellow teeth. Another began to scream. Then another. Within seconds, the enclosure erupted. The baboons threw themselves against the glass with such force that cracks spidered across it. They shrieked and clawed, their faces twisted with terror and rage, smashing their bodies against the barrier, as though trying either to kill the child or escape him. Catherine grabbed Damien and stumbled backward. The whole crowd panicked. Children wailed. Parents fled. A baboon struck the glass again, and blood burst from its snout, smearing across the clear wall. It kept hitting, again and again, until one eye hung red and wet from its socket. Damien did not cry. He looked almost amused. Catherine ran. By the time they reached the car, she was shaking so violently that she could not fasten her seat belt. Mrs. Baylock sat beside Damien in the back, one hand resting on his knee. There now, the nanny whispered. Poor animals, they know, don't they? Catherine turned sharply. Mrs. Baylock's face was blank. I said they frightened him, she said. But Damien was not frightened. Catherine saw his reflection in the car window. He was smiling. Father Brennan's death came in the storm. Robert tried to forget him, but the priest kept appearing. At the embassy, on the street, outside the house. Always pale, always sweating, always looking up as if the sky might split open above him. At last, Robert agreed to meet him. The meeting was set in a park near a church, beneath a sky the color of bruised metal. Wind moved through the trees. Leaves spun across the path. Father Brennan gripped Robert's sleeve with fingers so cold and tight they felt like wire. "He will not let me live much longer," Brennan said. "Who?" The priest looked at him with pity. "You know," Robert pulled free. "Tell me the truth." "I have told you the truth." "Tell me who his mother was." Father Brennan shut his eyes. "Conservatory, the old cemetery, the graves. Find the woman, find the child, you will see." The wind rose. The doors of the nearby church rattled. Brennan looked upward and began to panic. "I must get inside." He ran toward the church. Robert followed, confused. The first strike of lightning hit the roof. The explosion of sound knocked Robert to the ground. Tiles shattered. A metal rod from the church spire tore loose and spun downward through the storm, gleaming once in the white light. Father Brennan reached the steps and looked up. The rod fell like a spear from heaven. It drove straight through his body. The point entered at his shoulder, tore through bone, pierced lung and heart, then burst from his lower back in a spray of blood and black cloth. The force pinned him upright against the church door. His mouth opened wide, but no scream came out. Blood poured over his collar, his hands, the wood beneath him. One leg kicked twice, heel drumming against the stone step, then went still. Robert stared from the wet grass. The priest hung there, impaled before the house of God, his eyes wide and glassy, rain washing pink rivers down the church doors. Above him, the storm rolled on. When Robert returned home that night, he found Catherine at the top of the stairs. Damien stood behind her. At first, Robert thought Catherine was speaking to him. Then he saw her face. She was not speaking. She was frozen, one hand on the banister, her eyes wide. Damien sat on his tricycle. The little red wheels were still. Mrs. Baylock stood far below in the hall, looking up. "Catherine," Robert said. Damien pushed forward. The tricycle struck Catherine's legs. She screamed as she fell. Her body tumbled down the stairs, striking each step with a sickening crack. Her head hit the banister. Her arm twisted beneath her. One slipper flew off and landed near the bottom. She slammed onto the floor at Robert's feet, gasping like a fish, blood spreading beneath her hair. For 1 second, Robert could not move. Then he dropped beside her. "Kathy, Kathy." Her eyes fluttered, her lips parted. "My baby," she whispered. There was blood between her teeth. At the hospital, they told Robert she had lost the child. Catherine lived, but something in her had broken. She lay in a white bed beneath clean sheets, her face bruised, one arm in a cast, her neck supported, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She did not ask for Damien. She did not ask to go home. When Robert sat beside her, she turned her head slowly. "Do not let him near me," she whispered. Robert said nothing. "Promise me." He held her hand. Outside the hospital window, a black dog watched from the parking lot. That was when Keith Jennings entered Robert's life. Jennings was a photographer, sharp-faced and observant, the kind of man who could vanish behind a camera and see everything others missed. He had photographed Damien's birthday party. He had photographed Father Brennan. He had photographed Robert at the embassy and Catherine in the garden. He came to Robert with a folder of prints. "I know how this sounds," Jennings said, placing them on the desk. "But I think you need to see these." The first photograph showed Holly, the nanny, standing on the balcony at Damien's birthday party. Across her neck, where no shadow should have been, was a pale line, a rope-shaped line. Robert stared. Jennings placed down another photograph. Father Brennan, outside the embassy. A dark vertical mark ran through his body, from shoulder to hip. Like a spear. "These were taken before they died," Jennings said. Robert looked up at him. Jennings swallowed. "There's more." He showed Robert a photograph of himself, reflected in glass beside a street. A strange blur crossed his neck. Not a line this time. A jagged separation, as though his head were already half detached from his body. Jennings tried to smile, but his mouth trembled. "I think I'm next." They went to Rome. Robert told himself he was going to disprove it, that he would find some explanation, some record that exposed Father Brennan as a lunatic and ended this nightmare. But with every mile, every airport, every hotel room, every sleepless night, the truth moved closer. The hospital where Damien had been born had burned years earlier. Only blackened walls remained. In the ruins, they found Father Sparleto. He was alive, though the word seemed generous. He lived in a monastery, hidden away in a room that smelled of medicine, rot, and old fear. His face had been burned and twisted by fire. One eye was sealed shut by scar tissue. His hands were curled, the fingers fused like melted wax. When Robert entered, Sparleto turned his ruined face toward him and began to whimper. "Tell me," Robert said. The priest shook his head. Robert grabbed the front of his robe. "Tell me what you gave me." Father Sparleto made a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. He could barely speak. At last, with shaking effort, he pointed to a scrap of paper and scratched down the name of a cemetery. Servitory. Robert and Jennings went there, beneath a dead gray sky. The cemetery was ancient, its stone tombs half sunk into the earth, its paths choked with weeds. The air smelled of damp soil and old bones. Crows watched from crooked trees. The caretaker warned them to leave before dark, but Robert paid him and pushed on. They found the grave at the edge of the grounds. It bore the name of Maria Siena, Damien's supposed mother. Robert's hands shook as he lifted the iron bar. The stone lid scraped aside with a sound that made Jennings step back. Inside was not the skeleton of a woman. It was the skeleton of a jackal. The narrow skull grinned up at them. Long snout filled with small, sharp teeth, ribs collapsed inward, spine curled in the dirt. Scraps of matted fur still clung to bone. A stink rose from the grave, old and animal and wrong. Robert backed away, gagging. Jennings whispered, "My God." There was another grave nearby. Small, a child's grave. Robert knew before they opened it. He knew, but he still lifted the bar. He still forced the lid aside. He still looked down. Inside lay the bones of a newborn baby. His real son. The skull was crushed, not damaged by time, not broken by the collapse of stone. Crushed, the tiny head had been smashed in with deliberate force. The fragile ribs lay scattered. One small hand still curled against the chest, as if the baby had reached for someone in his last moment. Robert made a sound that was not human. He fell to his knees beside the grave. And for the first time since that night in Rome, he allowed the truth to enter him. His son had been murdered. His wife had been given a monster, and Robert had carried that monster into their home. From the darkness, beyond the tombs, came a growl. Jennings turned. The dogs came silently at first, then all at once. A pack of black dogs surged from between the graves, eyes burning, jaws open. They were not strays. They moved like one body, one mind, teeth flashing in the dusk. Jennings shouted and swung his camera bag. One dog seized it and tore it away. Another lunged at Robert's throat. Robert struck it with the iron bar. The skull cracked with a wet crunch, but the dog barely slowed. It snapped at his face, breath hot and rotten, saliva spraying his cheek. Jennings grabbed Robert and pulled him behind a tomb as another dog slammed into the stone hard enough to break its own jaw. Blood poured from its mouth, but it kept biting, teeth clattering against rock. They ran, through graves, through weeds, over broken stones, the dogs behind them snarling and shrieking. Robert slipped in mud and landed beside an open tomb. Inside, a skeleton lay with its mouth open, as if laughing. A dog leapt over him, claws raking his shoulder. Jennings kicked it away and dragged Robert up. They reached the car with seconds to spare. Dogs threw themselves against the doors as Jennings started the engine. One smashed its face through the side window, jaws snapping inches from Robert's cheek, glass buried in its gums, blood running down its black muzzle. Jennings reversed hard, crushing another dog beneath the wheels. It screamed as bone and tire met. Then the car lurched forward and tore out through the cemetery gates. Robert did not speak for a long time. Neither did Jennings. They both knew now. The next name was Bugenhagen. They found him in Megiddo, in a place of dust, heat, and old stones, where the land itself seemed to remember every war ever fought upon it. He was an old man with wise eyes and a grave voice. living among ruins and manuscripts, waiting as though he had known Robert would come. He listened to the story without surprise. Then he brought out the knives. 7 daggers lay wrapped in cloth. Their blades were dark, ancient, and strangely shaped, each one engraved with symbols Robert did not understand. They seemed to drink the light around them. "These are the 7 daggers of Megiddo," Bugenhagen said. "Only with these can the child be killed." Robert recoiled. The child, the thing wearing the child. Robert shook his head. Bugenhagen's expression did not soften. "You must take him to holy ground. There you must pierce him. Each dagger has its purpose. The first extinguishes the body. The others sever what is rooted inside it." Robert looked at the blades. He saw Damien asleep in his bed. Damien laughing in the garden. Damien holding a toy soldier. Damien looking up with that beautiful little face. "I cannot murder a child," Robert whispered. Bugenhagen leaned forward. "Then he will murder the world." Robert stood so quickly, the chair fell behind him. "No." He snatched up the cloth bundle, then threw it down again. "This is madness." He left. Jennings followed him into the heat outside. "You know he's right," Jennings said. Robert turned on him. "Do I?" "We saw the graves. I saw bones. You saw your son." Robert struck him. Jennings staggered back, one hand to his mouth. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then Jennings wiped blood from his lip. "I'm sorry," Robert said. Jennings looked toward the building. "We need those knives." Robert said nothing. Jennings went back inside. Robert waited by the road, trembling, hatting him, hatting himself, hatting the heat, the stones, the sky, the God who had allowed any of this to happen. Then he heard the noise. A truck had stopped nearby, loaded with panes of glass. Jennings came out of the building, carrying the bundle of daggers. He looked relieved, almost hopeful. "Robert," he called. The truck shifted. One of the panes slid loose. For a second, it caught the sun and became a sheet of white fire. Jennings turned. The glass dropped. It sliced through his neck as cleanly as a guillotine. His head came away from his body and struck the ground with a dull thud. His eyes remained open, still startled, still alive for one impossible instant. His body stood without it, hands twitching at his sides, blood jetting in bright pulses from the severed neck. Then it collapsed, knees folding beneath it, the bundle of daggers spilling into the dust. Robert stared. Jennings' head rolled slightly and came to rest facing him. The mouth opened once. No sound came out. Robert picked up the daggers. By the time he returned to London, Catherine was dead. Mrs. Baylock had gone to the hospital. She had entered Catherine's room with flowers and a calm smile. The nurse remembered her clearly. A polite woman, a family employee. No reason to stop her. Catherine had been asleep, or pretending to sleep. Mrs. Baylock set the flowers on the table. Then she closed the door. Catherine opened her eyes. The nanny stood beside her bed, looking down with an expression almost tender. "He will not share what is his," Mrs. Baylock said. Catherine tried to scream, but Mrs. Baylock's hand came down over her mouth. The other hand seized the IV line. Catherine thrashed weakly, broken ribs flaring with pain, cast scraping against the rail. Mrs. Baylock leaned her full weight across her, pressing the breath from her chest. The black eyes did not blink. Catherine's heart monitor began to race. Mrs. Baylock lowered her face close. "You should never have tried to take his place." Catherine bit her hand. The nanny hissed, then grabbed a metal instrument from the tray and brought it down across Catherine's face. Once, twice. The sound was soft and thick. Blood sprayed across the pillow. Catherine's body jerked. The monitor shrieked. Mrs. Baylock took the pillow and pressed it over Catherine's ruined face. Catherine kicked once beneath the sheet, then again, then nothing. When the nurses rushed in, Mrs. Baylock was gone. The official report called it an accident, a fall from the hospital bed, complications, internal trauma, words arranged neatly over horror. Robert stood beside Catherine's body in the morgue and looked at the bruises on her mouth. He did not cry. Something in him had moved beyond crying. That night, he returned to the house. The mansion stood in darkness, its windows reflecting the moon. The servants were gone, dismissed, perhaps, sent away by Mrs. Baylock. The front door was unlocked. Robert entered quietly. In his coat pocket were the daggers of Megiddo. The house felt alive, not haunted in the way of old stories, with cold spots and whispers. Alive, listening. The walls seemed to hold their breath. The chandelier crystals did not move, yet tiny reflections trembled across them like eyes. Robert climbed the stairs. He passed the nursery. The door was open. Damien's bed was empty. A floorboard creaked behind him. Robert turned. Mrs. Baylock stood at the end of the hall. She wore a dark dress. Her hair was neat. Her face was calm. "You should not have come back," she said. Robert reached into his pocket. The Rottweiler appeared from the shadows beside her. It lowered its head. Mrs. Baylock smiled. "Damien is sleeping." Robert pulled out a gun. The dog leapt. Robert fired. The shot shattered the hallway silence. The bullet struck the dog in the chest and threw it sideways against the wall. It hit the floor, legs kicking, blood spreading dark beneath its fur. But even dying, it tried to rise. It dragged itself forward, teeth snapping, claws scraping bloody lines into the polished wood. Robert fired again. The dog's head burst against the floor. Mrs. Baylock screamed. It was the first human sound Robert had ever heard from her, and there was nothing human in it. She charged him. They crashed into the wall. Her strength was impossible. Her hands closed around his throat and squeezed until sparks burst behind his eyes. Robert slammed his fist into her face. Once, twice, she did not loosen her grip. Her mouth opened in a snarl. Her teeth were slick with saliva. He drove his knee into her stomach and threw her backward. She struck a table, rose again, and came at him with a long kitchen knife in her hand. Robert grabbed her wrist. The knife trembled inches from his eye. Mrs. Baylock's face pressed close to his. "He is the son of the morning," she whispered. "He is the prince who was promised. You are only the man who carried him." Robert headbutted her. Her nose broke with a crack. Blood poured over her mouth. Still, she laughed. He shoved her down the stairs. She fell hard, striking the banister, tumbling into the hall below. For a moment, she lay still. Robert ran into Damien's room. The child stood beside the window. Moonlight silvered his face. He wore white pajamas. His hair was neat. He looked very small. "Daddy," Damien said. The word broke Robert in half. For an instant, he saw only a child. His child. The boy he had held, fed, carried. The boy whose fever he had worried over, whose drawings he had praised, whose sleeping face he had watched with a father's exhausted love. Then Damien turned his head slightly, and Robert saw the mark. It was hidden beneath the hair, at the crown of his scalp. The birthmark, 3 sixes, curled into the flesh like a brand. Robert backed away. Damien lifted one hand. "Daddy, I'm scared." Below them, Mrs. Baylock groaned. Robert grabbed Damien. The boy screamed. The sound tore through the house. Not a child's scream, not fully. It was layered with something deeper, something that seemed to come from beneath the floors and inside the walls. Glass cracked in the windows. A mirror burst in the hallway. Somewhere downstairs, Mrs. Baylock began to crawl. Robert carried Damien down the stairs. The boy kicked and clawed at him, suddenly wild, fingers digging into Robert's face hard enough to draw blood. Robert held on. Mrs. Baylock reached from the floor and grabbed his ankle. He almost fell. Her broken face looked up at him, one eye swollen shut, lips peeled back. "You cannot," she rasped. Robert kicked her away. She lunged again. He seized the fallen knife and drove it into her throat. Mrs. Baylock convulsed, both hands flying to the blade. Blood spilled between her fingers in thick black pulses. She gagged, eyes bulging, and collapsed onto the marble floor, her heels drumming until the sound slowed and stopped. Robert carried Damien outside. The car waited in the drive. Damien sobbed now, begging, pleading, calling him daddy again and again. Every word was a hook in Robert's flesh. "Please, daddy, please don't." Robert put him in the car and drove. The city blurred around them. Night streets, wet lamps, empty crossings. Damien twisted in the seat, crying so hard he hiccuped. Any police officer, any passerby, anyone who looked into that car would see a crazed man dragging a terrified child through London. And perhaps that was the final cruelty. Evil did not need to hide behind horns and smoke. Sometimes It hid behind a little boy's tears. Robert drove to a church. Its doors were locked. He kicked them open. The sound echoed through the sanctuary. Candles flickered before statues. Stained glass saints looked down with sorrowful eyes. The air smelled of incense and old wood. Robert dragged Damien down the aisle toward the altar. The boy screamed and clung to pews, his nails ripping. Robert pulled him free. At the altar, he laid Damien down. The child looked up at him, not pleading now, smiling. Robert unfolded the cloth. The 7 daggers glinted in candlelight. Damien's eyes darkened. For one moment, every candle in the church went out. The darkness was absolute. Then a voice spoke from the black. Not Damien's voice. Not any voice that should have fit inside a child. "Father," Robert sobbed. The candles flared back to life. Damien lay still on the altar, eyes wide, face innocent again. Robert raised the first dagger. Police sirens wailed outside. Men shouted. Boots thundered at the church doors. Robert looked down at Damien. The boy stared back, calm now, almost patient. The doors burst open. "Drop the knife." Robert did not. He brought the dagger down. A gunshot cracked through the church. Robert jerked. The dagger slipped from his hand and clattered across the stone. Another shot struck him in the chest. He fell beside the altar, blood spreading beneath him. His eyes fixed on Damien. The child sat up slowly. Police rushed forward. Someone lifted Damien into their arms. "It's all right," the officer said. "You're safe now." Damien rested his head on the man's shoulder. His eyes remained on Robert. Robert tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. He wanted to say the truth. He wanted to shout it so loudly the saints would hear. He wanted to tell them to look beneath the hair, to find the mark, to burn the daggers into the earth, to never let the child grow. But he could only choke. Damien watched him die. The funeral was attended by presidents, ambassadors, generals, statesmen, and grieving strangers who had read the headlines and wanted to mourn a tragedy they did not understand. Rain fell softly over the cemetery. Black umbrellas bloomed like dark flowers. Cameras flashed. Men in uniform stood solemnly beside the graves. 2 coffins were lowered into the earth. Robert Thorn, Catherine Thorn. The world spoke of madness, of a respected diplomat who had lost his mind after the death of his wife, of a child rescued from a terrible father, of grief becoming violence, of a family destroyed by tragedy. No one spoke of Rome. No one spoke of the priest impaled on the church door. No one spoke of the jackal's bones. Damien stood beside the mourners in a black coat. He held the hand of the President of the United States. He looked small among the powerful men, small and pale and beautiful. His face was composed in perfect sorrow. The cameras turned toward him, and then, as his father's coffin disappeared into the ground, Damien Thorn looked back over his shoulder. He looked directly into the lens and smiled. Years passed, as years do, even after evil has entered the world. People forgot the details. They always do. Horror becomes rumor. Rumor becomes myth. Myth becomes a joke told by those who never saw the bodies. But in certain rooms, behind certain doors, men still whispered. They whispered of a boy with no true mother. They whispered of a diplomat who tried to kill his own son on holy ground. They whispered of photographs that showed death before it happened. They whispered of priests who burned, women who fell, dogs that guarded nurseries, and a child who never seemed to age quite the way other children did. Damien grew. He learned languages quickly. He charmed adults. He stood at banquets beneath chandeliers and listened more than he spoke. He attended schools where other boys avoided him without knowing why. Teachers praised his intelligence, then resigned suddenly. Chaplains fell ill. Classmates who mocked him suffered accidents. A boy who pushed Damien into the mud during a school outing was found 2 days later in the river, his face pale beneath the water, reeds tangled in his mouth. A tutor who struck Damien's hand with a ruler slipped on the library stairs and broke his neck so completely that his head faced backward when the servants found him. A gardener who complained about the black dog tracks beneath Damien's window put his hand into a rose bush and screamed as something inside tore the flesh from his fingers. Infection followed. Fever followed. By the end, he was biting his own tongue and begging the nurses to cut off his arm. Through it all, Damien remained calm. He learned early that the world would protect him. That was the greatest joke of all. The world sees evil most clearly when it is poor, ugly, and desperate. It expects monsters in alleyways. It expects devils with dirty hands. It does not expect them in silk suits. It does not expect them at state dinners. It does not expect them smiling beside flags. Damien learned to smile. He learned to lower his eyes at the right time. He learned to speak softly about duty, destiny, faith, and peace. And behind him, always behind him, death moved like a loyal servant. Those who suspected him died strangely. Those who opposed him destroyed themselves. Those who loved him suffered most, because love was the door through which Damien entered. Robert Thorn had loved his wife enough to lie. Catherine had loved her son enough to doubt her own fear. Holly had loved Damien enough to hang herself before a crowd of children. Mrs. Baylock had loved, whatever looked out through his eyes, enough to die smiling with blood in her throat. And the world, foolish and hungry, would one day love Damien too. It would love his beauty, his confidence, his promises. It would love the way he spoke of order when people were afraid, of strength when people felt weak, of unity when nations trembled. It would love him because he would tell the frightened exactly what they wanted to hear. That someone was in control. That someone had a plan. That someone would make the chaos stop. And when the world finally knelt, it would not know it had been taught to kneel, since the night a storm struck Rome, and a desperate father accepted a child from a priest's trembling hands. There are some sins that do not end with death. They inherit, they mature, they wait for the right century. And somewhere, even now, there may be a nursery with a locked door, a child sleeping beneath clean sheets, a black dog watching from the garden, a mother standing in the hallway with one hand over her heart, wondering why the room grows colder whenever her child smiles. Perhaps she will tell herself she is tired. Perhaps the father will tell himself children are strange. Perhaps a priest will come too late. Perhaps a photograph will reveal the shape of the grave. And perhaps, when the birthday candles are lit, everyone will sing, and the child will look up toward the balcony, waiting for the first body to fall. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. If you enjoyed this descent into prophecy, blood, and the horror of a child who should never have been born, then stay close to the dark. Leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell me what frightened you most: the father's lie, the mother's fear, the priest's warning, or Damien's smile at the end. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment so